January 1st, 1945. A pale winter sun glances off snow-covered pines in the Vosges, and a quiet that feels like waiting sits over the narrow valleys. To the north, the Ardennes bulge is already collapsing under Allied pressure. To the east, Soviet armies grind forward. In the dead of that European winter, Hitler orders one last offensive in the west, Operation Nordwind, an attempt to wrench a new strategic opening, to shatter the American 7th Army, and to buy time for a Reich running out of both. It is a gamble born of desperation, and it will be settled not only by doctrine and courage, but by the unforgiving arithmetic of geometry and supply. At the heart of that arithmetic is a single blunt fact. The main German tank for the assault, the Panther, measured roughly the same across as many of the mountain roads it would have to use, about 327 meters. That numerical coincidence turned a technological edge into a tactical trap and became one of the decisive contributory failures of the operation. The strategic picture in early January is straightforward enough to understand and brutal in its implications. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last operational hope of splitting Allied armies, has failed to achieve a decisive rupture. German resources are stretched thin, railheads and fuel are scarce. The Reich's ability to put armor and men into the field is dwindling. Against this backdrop, Nordwind is conceived as a localized spear aimed at restoring a coherent front in Alsace and threatening Allied rear areas. If it worked, German lines could be stabilized and the Western Front's collapse delayed. If it failed, the price in men and equipment would be immediate and painful. The Reich's remaining mobile reserves, the last formations capable of maneuver, risked being consumed in a theater where recovery would be nearly impossible. On one side of a battered map sits General Johannes Blaskowitz, a professional soldier who peers at contour lines and road webs and sees something the political command cannot or will not apprehend. Blaskowitz warns that the Vosges, its thick forests, its medieval village streets, its single-track mule paths carved centuries earlier, do not invite modern armored warfare. These mountains favor infantry maneuver and ambush. They constrict tanks rather than welcome them. On the other side sits Hitler's order for attack, an ideological insistence that the Wehrmacht must strike regardless of the terrain or the council of experienced commanders. That friction between professional judgment and ideological insistence is a recurring theme in the last months of the war, and in Nordwind it will have operational consequences. The operational plan leans on what little remains of German armored punch. The spearhead includes elements such as the 21st Panzer Division, Panther-equipped, and elite SS mountain and infantry formations intended to push through corridors and seize key points. The doctrine in mind is classic German: achieve a Schwerpunkt, a concentration of force at a decisive point, then exploit the breach. For this, Panthers are central. They carry a high-velocity 75mm gun, with excellent long-range performance on paper, thick frontal armor, and mobility that once made them the envy of armored forces. But here, in the Vosges, those strengths will meet a physical limit. Consider the geometry. The Panther's width is often listed at approximately 3.27 meters, as stated in the source. Many of the mountain roads, the narrow causeways and village streets in parts of Alsace and the Vosges, measure right around that same width. The result is as simple as it is lethal. Tanks that, in open country, could deploy in depth and use their frontal armor and long-range guns to dominate a battlefield are forced into single-file columns when they pass through these confined squeeze points. A tank that fills a road entirely leaves no margin for bypassing a disabled vehicle, for lateral maneuver to avoid obstacles, for bounding overwatch, or for retreat without rebuilding a route for the entire column. Put another way, the Germans had built a race car for a track that did not exist. The Panther was optimized for wide fields and long sight lines. The Vosges presented narrow streets, hedgerow-lined lanes, and stone-walled villages. Draw an overhead of a 3.27-meter-wide tank silhouette, and then draw the line of a medieval road of the same dimension. There is no overlap for another track, no verge to slip onto. The advantages that make a Panther a potent fighting vehicle, its long barrel, its frontal protection, its striking power at distance, are neutralized when the engagement distances shrink and the road becomes the shape of the fight. That geometric constraint creates an immediate tactical cascade. Columns stretch for miles, one vehicle after another, and the lead vehicle becomes, in effect, the keystone of the formation. A disabled Panther in a narrow village street is not a localized problem to be bypassed. It is a traffic jam with cannons. Each minute the column stands still, multiplies exposure to flanking fire, artillery, and air attack. Each hour of delay burns fuel and ammunition. Each crew forced to abandon a vehicle adds to the manpower drain. A single mechanical failure, a bazooka hit in a cramped lane, a blocked bridge, any of these can freeze dozens of tanks in place. Close-quarter fighting in forests and rocky folds further strips away the Panther's advantages. In the Vosges, sight lines in dense woodlands fall to around 200 meters. Visibility drops to distances where the Panther's long-range gun can no longer be used optimally. The lethal long-range duels the Panther favored are replaced by short-range ambushes. Infantry with anti-tank weapons in hedgerows and attics, makeshift bazooka teams striking flanks from blind alleys, and panicked crews trying to turn enormous turrets in streets too tight to swing. The longer the column, the more opportunities for these micro-ambushes to accumulate damage. While the tactical picture deteriorates, logistics tell a parallel story. Tanks consume fuel at rates that depend heavily on terrain and operations. On paved roads in ideal conditions, a Panther might burn roughly 2.8 liters per kilometer. Under mountain conditions, climbing grades, stopping, idling, and maneuvering through mud or snow, consumption can rise to more than 7 liters per kilometer, as stated in the source. Add to that the fact that idling an engine in cold or while a crew works can consume around 5 liters of fuel per hour, as stated in the source. That arithmetic is stark. Delays measured in hours and days can turn a moving force into a stranded one simply because fuel reserves are finite. Supply lines for Nordwind are tenuous at best. Railheads are distant, road movement is choked with civilian traffic and damage from prior fighting, and Allied air power, especially the fighter-bomber wings of P-47 Thunderbolts, has grown ever more effective at interdiction. U.S. aircraft could hunt columns and drop fuel or ammunition convoys out of action. More important, the Americans possessed an industrial advantage that converted into sustained artillery and air support. Where German units had to ration shells, the United States could bring overwhelming artillery volumes to bear, and do so with increasingly sophisticated munitions, such as the proximity or VT fuse. Proximity fuses caused shells to detonate above ground, scattering lethal fragments over a larger area, and greatly increasing the effectiveness of artillery barrages against exposed troops and thin-skinned vehicles. The Germans could still fight, but their consumption rates, mechanical failure rates, and the attrition of supply began to outpace their ability to replace losses. The American defense under General Alexander Patch is not a straightforward line of stoic resistance. Patch practices a professional trade of trading space for time. He carefully withdraws forces into prepared defensive knots, old Maginot Line fortifications, pre-prepared artillery positions, and natural choke points that turn advance axes into funnels. That is strategic engineering. Shepherd the enemy into terrain that amplifies your strengths, then expend batteries and planes to make the cost unbearable. As German columns are funneled into narrow approaches by the contours of the Vosges and by deliberate American withdrawals, they become targets of multiplied effect. Tanks jam. Artillery concentrations find more targets together. Airstrikes from P-47s strike the columns and the thinly protected supply trains. The Germans can throw brave crews or hardened SS troops at the problem, but they cannot, in the face of sustained interdiction and overwhelming firepower, rebuild the logistical momentum they need. The unfolding of these mechanics can be seen in small visceral episodes. Imagine a Panther column in mid-January, engines clattering, dust and snow kicked up by treads. The lead Panther grinds around a bend, and its barrel catches the stonework of a village. The gun must be slung back, track links clatter, and the machine searches for a firm purchase on a narrow street. A bazooka team, hidden in a ruined house along the lane, waits for the flank and fires into a thinner side armor. The Panther stops. The crew tries to repair what can be repaired, but the street behind is filled with more Panthers, half of which are too tightly jammed to pass. Nearby SS mountain troops dismount and try to clear the buildings, but the forest around the village muffles sound and limits observation. The American forward observer, miles away but with a clear line to the valley on a snowy ridge, calls in an artillery concentration, and the hillside erupts. Shell bursts spray shrapnel down into the street. The column burns or it snags and dies of lack, of fuel, of parts, of time. Each of those vignettes contains a technical truth. A single disabled tank in a narrow street induces delays that translate into fuel consumption. Assume a Panther is idling or frequently starting and stopping. At roughly 5 liters an hour for idling alone, as stated in the source, a long delay of 10 hours consumes fuel that could have propelled the formation tens of kilometers under ideal conditions. If mountain driving consumes more than 7 liters per kilometer, as stated in the source, then a combination of terrain and delay reduces operational range quickly. When columns span many kilometers, logistical trains must stretch back to resupply, and those trains themselves become vulnerable to air attack and artillery. The arithmetic is ruthless. You cannot fight a mobile campaign without mobility, and you cannot maintain mobility without fuel in an environment that amplifies consumption while shrinking lines of movement. The Americans amplify the problem with art and industry. Artillery fired in volume, made more lethal by the VT fuse, turns choke points into killing fields. The proximity fuse, VT, detonates shells at a precise standoff from the ground, turning them into giant air bursts that are particularly effective against exposed troops and lightly armored vehicles. Against jammed columns in narrow valleys, these air bursts leave no safe pockets. Meanwhile, P-47 fighter bombers, operating with increasing ease as Allied big-picture air superiority hardens, are able to search for and strike German supply routes, fuel trucks, and disabled armor. The Germans, with their constrained logistics and limited available fuel, cannot match this sustained pressure. An accumulating number of tanks grow silent, not because their armor is pierced in a duel, but because engines fall mute when fuel is exhausted, because tracks are broken and spares are not at hand, because time turns tactical possibility into operational attrition. Between January 9 and January 21st, the offensive unfolds. Initial penetrations into Alsace create teeth and salience, but every gain proves costly to secure and supply. The mechanized spearheads find that moving forward does not guarantee freedom to maneuver once they meet the Vosges arteries. They must consolidate, resupply, and deal with the slow business of roads that cannot support their width without being transformed into linear death traps. The Americans respond by concentrating artillery and permitting the Germans to advance into prepared kill zones. The German command discovers that each meter gained requires a ratioally larger commitment of fuel and ammunition to hold. The attrition math favors the side that can replace losses faster. By now, that is clearly the Allies. As January wears on, the consequences become irreversible. Tank after tank is abandoned, or remains intact but immobile because engines have been run dry. The offensive grinds down into local actions and desperate attempts to hold gains with troops who lack the supply to do so for long. On January 25th, the German command effectively calls a halt. Operation Nordwind, begun as an attempt to restore operational potential, ends as another consumption of that potential. The government of the Reich has spent not only men and terrain, but the last significant mobile reserves that could have meaningfully delayed Allied advances elsewhere. Losses at Nordwind, approximately 22,000 German casualties and roughly 14,000 American casualties, as stated in the source, are heavy in human terms and heavier still in operational consequence. Armored divisions that survive the fighting are often stripped of vehicles and fuel, and the strategic reserve that might have defended the Rhine or conducted a mobile counterstroke is depleted. It is important here to avoid an easy narrative of causation. The 3.27-meter coincidence, the Panther's width matching narrow mountain roads, is not presented as the single cause of Hitler's defeat. The Reich fell because of a complex web: industrial capacity denied, two-front pressure, fuel shortages stretching back months, strategic misdirection by political leadership, and air and logistic superiority of the Allies. Yet the geometry in the Vosges represents a decisive, emblematic failure. It is the moment where technology and doctrine meet an immutable physical constraint, and where that constraint precipitates a collapse in mobility and supply at a critical moment. In operational terms, the 3-meter error is a lens. It shows how a seemingly small technical mismatch, vehicle dimension versus infrastructure, can act as a force multiplier for other weaknesses. That lesson carries several practical components. First, terrain can negate technological advantage. The Panther's long-range gun and frontal armor were formidable in open country. The woods and villages of the Vosges made that advantage irrelevant. Second, logistics set the ultimate tempo of modern warfare. No daring maneuver can survive if it cannot be supplied, and a single stuck vehicle can create an exponential consumption of fuel and time across a formation. Third, industrial depth matters. The Americans could sustain artillery barrages with VT fuses, replace losses, and keep fuel and ammunition flowing to frontline units. Germany could not. The result was not the victory of a single weapon, but of systems. Manufacturing, resupply, doctrine, command, and geography, working in tandem. Blaskowitz's warning about the mountains and their medieval roads is an example of professional military judgment, meeting an immutable constraint. When orders insist on a course of action decisively at odds with the physical and logistical realities of the operational environment, sound units do what they can, but the risk of consuming irreplaceable reserves is real. For the Reich in January 1945, the price of ignoring that constraint was the expenditure of formations that could have been used to delay the Allied crossing of the Rhine by weeks, or deprive the Soviets of contested terrain farther east. In other words, Nordwind did not by itself end the war, but the mobilizable reserves it squandered shortened Germany's strategic options and accelerated the collapse of a military system already beginning to fail. There are human scenes within the arithmetic that help us feel the scale of loss. A Panther crewman, young and exhausted, shifts in frozen clothes and looks over a street full of engines that will not start. He lights a cigarette and hears the distant thump of artillery. Someone nearby curses when a tow cable snaps. An American forward observer, cold and precise, calls down fire that she hopes will ignore the misery of men but will do its job, protect the position and stop the column. Commanders, officers with maps smoothed by too many hands, utter a quiet grief when supply reports return numbers that make movement impossible. These are not scenes of moral judgment, but of operational reality. Men caught in arithmetic larger than their personal valor. If there is a single dramatic image that crystallizes the entire episode, it is of panthers sitting, hulks in pockets of snow. Strong, lethal machines rendered mute because they lack the one thing that makes them weapons in a maneuver war: mobility. Their guns are intact, their crews are often willing, but without fuel and without room to maneuver, they are monuments to misapplied design, misread terrain, and failing logistics. The broader lesson for military thinkers is uncomfortable yet practical. Technological superiority matters, but only when systems are aligned with environment and supply. A superior tank cannot dominate if the road network is too narrow, if fuel consumption is underestimated, if the enemy can deliver artillery and air at scale. Historical analysis of Nordwind suggests that Hitler's insistence on offensive action, combined with the mismatch between Panther design and Vosges infrastructure, the U.S. approach of trading space for time, and the overwhelming industrial and logistical edge of the Allies, all coalesced into a failure that consumed Germany's last mobile reserves. When we say the 3-meter error that led to Hitler's final defeat, the phrasing is intentionally provocative. The 3-meter coincidence did not, in isolation, defeat Hitler. Rather, it symbolized a wider systemic failure. The Reich's inability to reconcile technological aspirations with the physical and logistical realities of late-war Europe. That geometry, tank width against medieval roads, made a decisive contributory difference because it triggered a cascade. Tactical vulnerability in confined spaces, increased fuel consumption from idling and maneuvering in difficult terrain, as noted in the source, amplified exposure to artillery and air interdiction, and ultimately the consumption of mobile reserves that the German High Command could no longer replace. The Vosges campaign is also a reminder that a battlefield is not only where shells meet armor, but where maps, rails, weather, and industrial production all intersect. Strategic power flows from factories and wharves, from fuel stockpiles and railheads, from the accuracy of logistical forecasts. When those flows are disrupted or insufficient, even brilliant doctrine and brave crews will be outpaced by attrition. As you consider this episode, a question remains practical and provocative. Faced with the same operational constraints, what would you choose? Panthers with limited fuel and the hope that terrain would miraculously bend, or a more modest vehicle with assured supply? Comment below with what you would recommend. Command a Panther with no reliable resupply, or a Sherman with unlimited fuel and ammunition? Which would you trust to hold a line in the Vosges? If this kind of technical operational deep dive into World War II interests you, like and subscribe for more analyses that blend maps, machines, and the human decisions that sit between them. Share this episode with someone who loves the intersection of terrain and technology. In the end, the image of panthers stranded in snow is a stark historical metaphor. Machines optimized for domination are only as effective as the terrain, logistics, and strategy that enable them. The 3.27-meter match between Panther Width and Mountain Road is an easy detail to latch onto, but its true power as a historical explanation lies in how it reveals a larger truth. That in the winter of 1945, the arithmetic of supply and the constraints of geography mattered more than the proud metal of any tank. The Vosges had no patience for mismatched engineering or ideological gambits. It simply kept its narrowness, and empires found that there is no substitute for the steady work of keeping engines moving and lines unbroken.